Okay, so we proceed now. We go now to the next topic in our outline, no, which is risk management. So when we talk about um, risk management is defined as coordinated activities undertaken by administrations to direct and control risk. So when we talk about administration, we're talking about the Bureau of Customs in the case of our country, the Philippines, no? Coordinated risk management are coordinated activities undertaken by administrations, in this case the Bureau of Customs, to direct and control risk. No, it does not refer to a specific or to just a single activity, but rather it refers to a collective program or collective activities as one, which is being undertaken by the Bureau of Customs to direct and control risk. If you look at your WCO manual or guidelines for post-clearance audit, the risk management process has been outlined there. There are five major aspects or five major components of the risk management process. So number one, you can follow this from your PCA guideline or PCA manual. First is establishing the context. Second is the risk assessment, which involves risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation and prioritization. Third is the risk treatment. Fourth, recording, communication, and consultation. And fifth, monitoring and review. So as we have mentioned, there are five major components of the risk management process, no? As outlined in your WCO manual or guidelines for post-clearance audit. The first one is establishing the context of the post-clearance audit, or establishing the context of risk management. When we say we establish the context of risk management, we establish the goals, objectives, strategy, scope, and parameters of the activity or part of the organization to which the risk management process is being applied. So to explain it in a more simple manner, no, we simplify or we delineate, we identify which specific aspect of the organization or of the operation we wish to look into. Do we only wish to look into the importation aspect? What specific documents do we wish to look into? Do we just want to look at the invoice? Do we just want to look at the proof of payment? Do we want to look at the documents covering insurance or covering the freight? What documents do we need to look or do we want to look into? So we establish the goals or the coverage of the outline when we establish the context of the risk management here. We also identify which part of the organization we would like to look into when we conduct the audit. Do we look into the finances of the organization, or do we just simply look into the operation side of the organization? So when we establish the context of the risk management program or process, again, we establish the goals, objectives, strategies, scope, and parameters of the activity or organization which we want to look into in the process of managing the risk. When we talk about establishing the context, no, we also want to establish risk criteria. So when we talk about criteria, these are characteristics which you wish to look into, or these are aspects which you wish to look into when managing or when looking at the risk management process. For instance, an example could be revenue leakage, as we have been constantly monitoring. Since the Bureau of Customs is tasked with collecting revenues, then obviously one of the things that the BOC would want to look into is the risk of revenue leakage, and where are those leakages possible, where can those leakages possibly be. So again, leakages can come in the form of undervaluation. So when we undervalue, there is a potential of losing revenue. When we misdeclare, there is a possibility of losing revenue or leakage of revenues. Again, when we use the incorrect rates, diba? Error in the application of rates, there is also a possibility of revenue leakage. So we identify those things, and we also identify how much threshold is acceptable. For instance, kung halimbawa the revenue leakage is just simply 1% or a negligible amount, then there is no need, or there can be no need, or there is no desirable purpose for still conducting a post-clearance audit. Diba? If the negligible, or if the potential revenue leakage is just of a negligible percentage or negligible amount, then for practical reasons, there can be no practical value for still conducting a post-clearance audit. So this is why it's important for the risk criteria to also be established. So not just the coverage, or not just the context of the risk, but also the criteria for the risk. If you are on the lookout for watching out for revenue leakage, you also set the limits or the threshold. Kung negligible naman, then you can let go of that in that instance, no? So your PCA guidelines or PCA manual also differentiates. Take note of this, no? It also differentiates between two concepts: strategic risk management and tactical risk management. So when we talk about strategic risk management or assessment, it is based on customs being able to identify the overall risk posed by an entire sector or group of importers. So it's not just one, it's not just a single importer, it's not just a single trader, but you are looking at an entire sector or an entire group. It may be an industry of importers. So by identifying such group, the Bureau of Customs can target all or selected companies from that group or within that sector identified as high risk. So there are reasons, or there are criteria why or how an industry can be considered or can be classified as high risk. So these are outlined also in your manual, such as number 1, strategic importance of the industry to national interest; 2, international trade agreements which govern the industry; 3, public health and safety; 4, intellectual property; and 5, economic and environmental impact of the imports or exports of that particular industry. So when we talk about tactical risk management, on the other hand, no, as contrasted with or as differentiated from strategic risk management, when we talk about tactical risk management, it is a process of identifying groups of high-risk transactions naman dito. So when we talk about tactical risk management, we talk about groups of high-risk transactions, either by a particular importer or exporter. So in this case, when we talk about tactical risk management, we talk about a single importer or exporter, but we talk about groups of high-risk transactions by them. Okay? When are these transactions considered high risk? Number 1, kapag yung value and volume niya is considerable or is significant, is also considered high risk depending on the type of goods imported or exported. It's also considered high risk if there were previous irregularities with respect to past importations or exportations, and also whether or not a first-time importer or exporter, then it's also considered in determining whether high risk or hindi yung specific transactions by a particular importer or exporter. So when we talk about risk assessment, the second aspect or the second component of the risk management process, we are talking about 3 things. No? First is risk identification, second is risk analysis, and third is risk evaluation and prioritization. So first, regarding risk identification, the following elements can assist in identifying risk: performance of an industry against legislative or administrative requirements, performance of individual auditees, elements of individual auditees' operations. So for example, robustness of internal control, separation of duties and tasks, and results of external reviews if there are appropriate results. Second is risk analysis. When we talk about risk analysis, it is the systematic use of available information to determine how often defined risk may occur and the magnitude of their likely consequences. So likelihood and consequences can be determined using a rating scale, either high, medium, or low, or on a numerical scale. So these two measures, likelihood and consequence, taken together, they determine the overall level of risk. Once again rated as high, medium, or low. Third one is risk evaluation and prioritization. Now that you have identified the risk and now that you have identified the likelihood and the consequences of such risk, then you evaluate and you prioritize. It should be based on the analysis that you have made and the risks that you have identified. So you prioritize, and based on the priority that you have made, you allot your resources, or the Bureau of Customs allots its resources to conduct the post-clearance audit. So the third element or component of the risk management process is risk treatment. Now that you have identified the risks involved, and now that you have prioritized or arranged this risk by priority, now you address this risk. You treat this risk and you address them. The key risks which you have earlier identified should be treated in order to reduce the likelihood and consequence of the risk occurring by putting in place control measures and actions that are intended to modify the level of risks to fit the organizational tolerance. Explained in a simple manner, so when the Bureau of Customs is able to identify risks, then it puts into place several mechanisms to address such risks. What are these mechanisms? Well, of course, the post-clearance audit is one of those mechanisms which the Bureau of Customs has in place to address the risk of revenue leakage. What other mechanisms are there? Aside from post-clearance audit, there are mechanisms such as special surveillance, possible inspection by the Bureau of Customs of goods openly offered for sale. So those are just examples of how the Bureau of Customs treats the risk that it has identified. Okay? It has to address those risks by putting in place mechanisms to address or to counteract the risk that it has identified earlier. Communication and consultation. So this is the fourth aspect of risk management process. So, communication and consultation with internal and external stakeholders should also be conducted as an appropriate stage of the audit process for the process as a whole. Good governance requires decision making that is accountable and transparent. To ensure accountability, it is important that the recording indicates why decisions were made and why actions were taken. Therefore, the audit results needs to be well recorded and stored in a way that enables their quick retrieval and dissemination. So when a post-clearance audit is conducted, again, it's important that in every step of the way, communication is constantly conducted between the Bureau of Customs and the auditee, and transparency is also observed whenever decisions are being made in the process of conducting an audit. When we talk about transparency, the decision is there, and the decision is amply or sufficiently backed up by the evidence or by the records on hand. Okay, these records or these pieces of evidence should be recorded, kept on the records, and are stored so that in the event that the decision is questioned, then these records can easily be re-examined or be retrieved. So finally, the last component of the risk management process is monitoring and review. They are integral steps of the risk management process because it's necessary to determine If previously identified risks are still present, current, or valid, it's necessary to identify new risks if there are new risks. Number 3, it is necessary to reevaluate risk levels assigned previously in light of updated information. And number 4, it is necessary to evaluate the effectiveness of compliance activities or measures undertaken to address the risk. When we talk also about risk management, we also talk about, or we should also know about intelligence systems. So when we talk about intelligence, it means, or it is defined as follows: product derived from the collection and processing of relevant information, which acts as basis for evaluating risk and making informed decisions when developing an audit plan. So taken as a whole, in essence, this intelligence essentially refers to information that the Bureau of Customs possesses or has in its possession, which it may use to identify importers, to identify risk, to identify possible auditees, and to identify or to evaluate whether or not the declarations of these respective importers are correct or should be adjusted. So in other words, the information that the BOC has is a very powerful tool when it does or when it conducts its post-clearance audit.